Hello, my name is Tammy Rose, and welcome to Conquered Days. Today we have a quote from Hawthorne. Eager souls, mystics, and revolutionaries may propose to refashion the world in accordance with their dreams, but evil remains. And so long as it lurks in the secret places of the heart, utopia is only the shadow of a dream. Welcome to the show. We have Richard Smith with us. Hey, Richard. Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Nice to see
Lovely
you.
to see you.
And I am very excited about our special guest this week, a good friend of mine. We've done a lot of programs together. I would like to introduce literary historian Rob Villella. Like I don't know your name. Rob Villella. Hi, Rob.
Hey, good to see you folks. We've been saying so many terrible things about this pandemic forcing us to be virtual, but it's so nice to connect to you from 600 miles away from Concord today.
Yes, how's Pittsburgh today?
It's not bad. The rain's cleared up, so.
Excellent.
Well, and could you actually describe the background that you have? Even though you're in Pittsburgh, you're actually sitting at the Old Manse, right?
This is actually the Wayside. So this is the
Wayside
room that Hawthorne had built after the family returned from their European travels. And you can actually see the portrait of Hawthorne, which still exists there today. The Wayside, of course, is the one that's run by the National Park Service.
Yes, and I worked there for 2 years when I was a seasonal ranger. And it gets insanely hot upstairs in that room, which I'm sure Mr. Hawthorne realized that very quickly after he built it.
Right.
So Rob, you're a literary historian, and I know that you've been involved with the National Park Service, amongst other things. How did you get into literary history? Was it something you were always into? Were you a kid who was reading obscure 19th century novels? How did all of this happen?
That's a great question. So I think I was that kid when I was in school that liked all the books that were assigned. You weren't supposed to like them. You were just supposed to do your homework and call it a day. But I actually liked the books that they were forcing us to read. And then when I went to college, I started off with a very different path and then realized, all signs point to literature. So I changed my major and became an English major with a focus on American literature. And one of my mentors in that era was Dr. Joseph Zaitchik, my American literature professor, for I think 5 different courses. And we became really good friends. And I took a course with him that was called Selected Authors. And it gave him the opportunity to pick whichever authors he was most interested in that he could share with students. And this particular one was on Hawthorne, Emerson, and Walt Whitman. And there were maybe 5 people in that class. And I think what I learned from that class was, first of all, I couldn't be absent because there were only 5 people in that class. But also that it was okay to like literature. It was okay to say out loud in front of other people, hey, I actually like these people. I'm actually enjoying this literature. And then, I've had different careers over the years, but I've always had this interest in 19th century American writing on the side. And I've explored it in different ways. I was a tour guide for a while. I've helped curate exhibits at museums and libraries. I've done presentations and lectures and talks. And I do living history performances, most notably as Nathaniel Hawthorne. And I think that's how Richard and I met many years ago when I first moved back to Massachusetts. And I've moved all over at this point. I was kind of looking for something to do on the side. And I'd met this weirdo that liked to dress up as a dead writer. And I thought, hey, I could probably do that too.
And make a living at it.
Oddly enough, people give us money to do these strange things.
Well, but when we met, you were a ranger at the Longfellow House.
That's right, and I was a ranger at the Longfellow House for about 7 years. And actually, Longfellow was one of those ones that I wasn't really into, but it was in part because I hadn't really been deeply exposed to him. And after 7 years at the Longfellow House in Cambridge, I came to really appreciate him, and especially because he was connected to just about everybody in the 19th century literary world.
Hmm.
And right, because when we first met, I actually, before I even knew about your interest in Hawthorne and Poe and the others, I remember thinking of you as a Longfellow expert before any of those other guys that you portray or who you write about. So did you learn to accept him and really like him because you happened to be at his house every day?
I mean, you had to. The house, which is another one run by the National Park Service, the house is so perfectly preserved, you can't help but feel his presence. And, you know, and I think my interest in Longfellow is kind of similar to my interest in a lot of other writers of the period. The most famous ones, the most famous examples of their writing are the ones I like the least. Right. And I tend to like the more oddball ones. So, you know, put aside Paul Revere's Ride and focus on other ones instead. You might find something you like.
Well, and I have a question for both of you. When you meet tourists and you encounter tourists, they really know these authors primarily through their writings, and maybe they have a little bit of the biographical information. How do you feel like your perspective is different by hanging around both the houses and the places that these people actually have lived in? How is your perspective different from like a professor or, you know, somebody who's more, you know, quote unquote, formally trained in the literature aspect of it?
Well, I feel like my job as a historical interpreter, or if I'm portraying Thoreau, I think that some people who come to Walden Pond, or a lot of people that come to Walden Pond, they've got a very basic, at least basic information or knowledge of Thoreau. My job, I feel like, is to maybe fill in the blanks, whether I'm portraying Henry or whether I'm myself, fill in the blanks, maybe try to get rid of some of the misconceptions that they might have about some of these people, and try to make them more well-rounded historical figures. So he's not just the guy that lived at Walden Pond, or Louisa isn't just the woman who wrote Little Women. You know, I find myself talking more about their personal lives than about their literature, because I want to really people to understand that they were people first and writers second.
And I would agree with that. I think the role is to take them off the page and really flesh them out in flesh and blood and say, you know, maybe you really struggled with reading the Scarlet Letter, but Nathaniel Hawthorne was a real person who took up physical space, who had friends, who had enemies, who had hopes and dreams, and wasn't just setting out to frustrate you in your 7th grade English class.
Right. I think that, you know, there are writers from the 19th century that I really like as people who I don't really care that much for their writings. But as a character or a personality, I'm totally enamored by them. I don't think I really like any of Ellery Channing's poetry, but as a Concord personality, I find him absolutely fascinating. So I think that's our job, is to make these people seem alive, whether we're portraying somebody or anything like that. We want to make sure that they're living people so they get it. So Rob, you've kind of become known as the guy who portrays Hawthorne. How did your interest in Hawthorne? Did it come out because of Longfellow, or were you into Hawthorne before?
I've always liked Hawthorne for as long as I can remember. And certainly I think he came before my interest in Longfellow. I think I was that nerd in class who just liked the Scarlet Letter more than anybody else. And I think when I started thinking about the possibility of portraying characters from this period, Hawthorne came to mind because I knew nobody else would be willing to do it the way that I would, because I really do admire his work. I really love his stories. I like his life story as well. And I had done a play by then that featured Ralph Waldo Emerson and Oliver Wendell Holmes and James Russell Lowell and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And I had portrayed the young Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, but it didn't seem like the right fit for me. So when I made the decision, I got to try Hawthorne. I picked out some wardrobe pieces and so forth, but I actually went to Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. And I know Richard's heard this story a million times, but I visited Hawthorne at his final resting place. I'm standing over his grave, waiting for, the tourists to kind of disappear so we could have a real conversation. And I'm standing right above where Nathaniel Hawthorne is buried. And I'm kind of spelling out for him, this is what I plan on doing. I'm going to put on an outfit and pretend to be you and read your stories out loud. And I just wanted to get your blessing on it. And I still swear this is true. The wind blew in that exact moment. And I heard, no. And of course, my response was, listen, Nate, I didn't expect you to say anything else, I'm doing it anyway. Be thankful it's me and not somebody else.
Right. When people ask me what Thoreau would think of me being thorough, my answer is, oh, he would think this is absolutely totally ridiculous. He would hate everything about it.
Exactly. And I think my portrayal of Hawthorne is based on the idea that my interpretation is Hawthorne wanted you to read his writing, but wanted you to leave him out of it.
Right.
So, my Hawthorne is very shy. He hates doing this. You've seen some of the programs where I do, where I read a couple of stories, and at the end I just say, as Hawthorne, I no longer wish to continue reading to you. And I just walk away, and that's the end of my program. So,
well, so Rob, so you had mentioned that you were in a play. Like, what's the name of that play?
So I wrote a play years ago called At the Saturday Club, and Richard actually was in one of the characters in it. So it's a 4-person, 1-act play. And the idea was, it was actually celebrating Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's another author that I really admire, who most people don't seem to know enough about because they read only Old Ironsides and nothing else. But the idea was Holmes outlives all of his other friends. He lives until 1894. And by then, everyone is dead from his social circle. So the play was based on the idea of a true story where just for fun one day, he took a big whiff of ether just to see what would happen. And in the play, he has this this dreamscape where some of his dead friends come back for dinner with him. And it's a fun story. Like, it starts off really lighthearted, then it gets really serious, talking about slavery and abolition and the Civil War and things like that. And then when his trip is over, he reveals what he learned. And this is actually a true story. This is a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes. After he inhaled this ether, he said, the universe was open to him and all the secrets of the world were revealed to him. And he quickly wrote down this big revelation. And when he came to, he realized what he had written was, a strong smell of turpentine prevails throughout.
Yes, I portrayed James Russell Lowell in that play.
To your chagrin, but you did a good job.
Right. Yeah, but we did it for, where did we do it? We did it at Harvard, did we not?
Yeah, we did it for Harvard Medical School. We did it for the Massachusetts Historical Society. And we even did a private show for St. Botolph's Club in Boston.
Right. Yeah, they gave us a stage that was like 2 feet square.
Yeah, it was like they were actually having dinner, and we were basically having dinner with them at their table trying to perform this play. But it was fun. And, it got back to that same thing we were saying, where it wasn't just about their writing, but it really was talking about these are people with relationships and connections, and how would they relate to one another and interact.
No, I remember in the play, there's actually a couple of sections where they're all kind of giving each other crap and kind of making fun of each other and like anything else, if I remember correctly, you based everything on actual conversations and letters and diaries and things like that. Yeah,
and that's kind of, and you and I both do this the same way. That's kind of the MO, is we try to find real words to express what we're trying to have the historical figures say, because they probably can say it better than we can do.
So
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I've definitely seen both of you do a performance at the Thoreau annual gathering that's just made up of quotes, but you essentially assemble it into a conversation between Thoreau and Hawthorne.
Right. That was the program that we do, the Hawthorne Thoreau program that we do. We actually debuted it at the annual gathering. Gosh, it's been what, 5 or 6 or 7 years since we first did it.
I think it's even longer than that, but we've done it a few times, and we've got it coming up again. The House of Seven Gables is sponsoring us at the end of June. What we loved as we were putting this together was, it doesn't make sense, but it does. Hawthorne and Thoreau really got along. They had a lot in common, probably more than they either of them wanted to admit. These are two solitary figures who are desperately trying to connect while also not trying to connect with others. And sort of, I mean, it's hard to describe the relationship, which is why this program is so amazing, because it really fleshes out all those complications.
Well, but it's harder in that situation to be Thoreau, because he says literally nothing about Hawthorne in any of his journals, and he only mentions him a couple of times in letters, whereas Hawthorne is constantly dishing the dirt on Thoreau and giving his opinion about him, not always a good opinion. And so, but I always say that as long as they didn't discuss literature or nature or religion, they
politics,
all their favorite things.
They got along just fine.
Yeah. Can you guys trace the actual friendship for those of our listeners who may not be as familiar with the actual interaction between those figures? Can you say sort of how they met and why they hung out and how they hung out?
Go ahead.
Well,
Rob.
the first interaction probably started with the Old Manse. So when Hawthorne is kind of convinced to move to Concord by Ralph Waldo Emerson, there's this garden waiting for him as a present from Thoreau. And it goes from there. I think Thoreau is trying to introduce Hawthorne to the world of Concord as he saw it. The world of Concord to Thoreau was growing, nature, and the river, and the pond. They do go to Walden Pond at one point, but the biggest story was when Thoreau sells his boat to Hawthorne, the Pond Lily, as Hawthorne called it, which Thoreau more famously called the Muscataquid, and used on his expedition for a week on the Concord and Merrimack River. And we love that part of the story because Hawthorne buys this boat in exchange for a little bit of money and some boating lessons. And Hawthorne's observations as he attempts to steer this boat with the same ability that Thoreau has, it's hilarious because in Hawthorne's view, he's trying to learn from Thoreau, and Thoreau seems to just be able to will this boat to just move and steer on its own. And Hawthorne has no ability like that. And he's just sort of like, this man is a wizard.
Right. It's like the original Odd Couple, you know?
Well, and I think that they both saw that awkwardness in each other. I mean, there are plenty of good stories about Thoreau being awkward around lots of people and Hawthorne being awkward around lots of people. They didn't have to be awkward around each other. And that kind of relaxed both of them. Another great story from the same time was when Thoreau and Hawthorne and Emerson went ice skating on the river. And Sophia Hawthorne writes one of the most amazing descriptions of the three of them and the different ice skating styles. And so in our program that we do, we use a lot of those sort of descriptions. We have not just stuff from Thoreau and Hawthorne, but stuff from Emerson and Mrs. Hawthorne and Ellery Channing and Bronson Alcott. We're really trying to bring in all of the Concord personalities into the story. But the best part is, we spend 10 minutes completely saying nasty things about Ellery Channing from both of us, And
so wait, so you had brought up Ellery before, and I wasn't going to say anything because he's sort of, he seems to me like the typical, ne'er-do-well who gets married, has some kids, and then, just sort of wanders away and stops supporting them and is like, I'm going to be a poet. And as you said, like his poetry isn't always that great, right. But he was like Henry's best friend in later years. So,
yeah. And Hawthorne had lots of good things to say about him. He said bad things about him, but he said a lot of good things about him as well.
I think that's Hawthorne's style. I don't think he says anything good about anybody without backing it up with something negative to even it out. One of the famous quotes is when he first meets Thoreau, he refers to him being ugly as sin.
Right.
But then he follows it up with, but I couldn't imagine him looking any differently and it suits him. So he actually meant it as a compliment. And I think that's emblematic of Hawthorne as a whole. Everything he writes is a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Somehow it's the duality, it's the contradiction, it's the ambiguity that makes Hawthorne who he is.
So Rob, you kind of have made your bread and butter, so to speak, really trying to bring to life obscure 19th century American writers, people who are no longer really read, or even people that nobody even really thinks about anymore. Do you feel like that's become your thing? I mean, it's almost like you've been on a mission for all these years to bring these people to life that nobody really knows who they are.
Well, it's almost because of context. So, everything that you see is representative of a greater whole. So, for example, we know Uncle Tom's Cabin was a big book when it came out in 1852, but do people know that there were knockoffs of that book that came out by the dozens in the years that followed, both pro-slavery and anti-slavery? So, Stowe Harry Beecher Stowe was part of this movement of anti-slavery literature that also had its, its antithesis. And even with some of the transcendentalists, Thoreau writing nature essays wasn't that unusual, because there's this series of travel writings and nature writings written by people that you've never heard of, or are works by somebody you have heard of, but you never knew they wrote something like this. Margaret Fuller, for example, writes her Summer on the Lakes, and she's not known for it now, certainly. But when that book first came out in 1845, it was kind of a big deal, and it's only a few years before Walden.
And some literary historians actually think that her book may have been a slight influence on Thoreau when he was doing A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers.
And I would believe that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and she has passages in there where she's witnessing Native Americans gathering, and it's a completely different story in 1945 and sort of what she's witnessing in the years before than it is, less than 20 years later when Thoreau is traveling to Minnesota. And the Great Lakes areas where he's aware that there is a lot of tension happening, and suddenly the whole, the whole reckoning for the Native Americans and the white people who are trying to take over the land. That's a whole different perspective.
And I think that's an important thing, because it goes back to what we were saying earlier, going beyond the text on the page. There's also all kinds of things happening in the world around them. Does it matter, for example, who is president of the United States while these people are writing their literature? Of course it does. What kind of political climate, what kind of cultural climate is out there? Even the industry, the idea of printing books, and certainly both Hawthorne and Thoreau experience the growing pains of a relatively new publishing industry in the United States and a relatively young reading audience that is just building literacy in a relatively young country. We know Hawthorne, for example, when he first starts writing, the tradition was authors didn't use their names. So his first several stories are published anonymously. And comically, there's a rumor in Salem that there's somebody who's been writing these stories, and Elizabeth Peabody, this is such a great story, goes knocking on the door of the Hawthornes asking to see Hawthorne's sister because he heard she's been writing. Well, it wasn't Hawthorne's sister that was writing, but Elizabeth Peabody thought these were very stereotypical women's writings. And so she's surprised that it's actually by Nathaniel. And of course, Thoreau experiences the problem of finding a publisher, The Week on a Concord and Merrimack Rivers, and ends up self-publishing. And what a disaster that ended up being, So all of these components outside the written word is so important to what's happening in the written words.
And Hawthorne is so unlike the rest of the Concord gang. And I want you to talk a little bit about that. And so I want to start with saying, for people that may or may not know, listen very carefully, Nathaniel Hawthorne is not a transcendentalist.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
So, and politically, socially, he's not like the rest of these people, is he?
And it's very strange, because I think Hawthorne was enamored with Concord, even as he is diametrically opposed to the people of Concord, and particularly the people that we think of, like the Alcotts, like the Emersons. And there are great stories, for example, about how he stays loyal to his best friend, Franklin Pierce, in a series of situations where probably loyalty made no sense to the other people in the Concord intellectual circles. The best way to justify it is just they literally were best friends. They stood by each other through thick and thin, regardless of what anybody else thought. And of course, the Emerson refuses to have a book by Hawthorne that was dedicated to Franklin Pierce, and ends up ripping the dedicatory page out of that book. And that's a true story, we know, because we have the book still that Emerson ripped that page out of.
They went to college together, correct? Pierce and Hawthorne. That's
right, yeah. And Franklin Pierce, I think, is the first person that Nathaniel Hawthorne meets on the way to Bowdoin College. They hadn't even gotten to campus yet. They meet at a train station. And Franklin Pierce is maybe the year above him or something like that. And it's inexplicable, other than, who could explain friendship? They clicked, they became friends, and they stayed friends for their entire lives. Yeah. But Hawthorne wasn't part of the reformations that the other people of Concord were doing. He wasn't concerned about the anti-slavery movement. He wasn't concerned about women's rights. He wasn't a part of all of that stuff. In fact, he was very suspicious of all these reforms and kind of had this just negative outlook that reforms couldn't make a difference anyway because we're all inherently doomed. We're all inherently terrible. Sort of like that quote that Tammy started us off with, that the evil is always there, no matter how much you try to fix things. And I think that reflects on his attitude working with other people. It's reflected in his writings, certainly. And I think it also shows why he was a little standoffish as a human being to be around.
Well, and I think in that sense, he was more like almost everybody else in Concord at the time than the little weird transcendental circle. Most people in Concord did not care about slavery or anti-slavery. They did not care about women's rights. They didn't care about reform. They're just doing their job and trying to put food on the table and raise their family. And I think that and that was Hawthorne's concern. He had this growing family. He's trying to be a writer after many fits and starts. And so who's got time to be an anti-slavery advocate when I've got 3 kids and my books aren't selling?
Well, and I think we're touching upon a really subtle point where it's not like, Nathaniel Hawthorne wants to be a slave owner and thinks that people should be subjugated and that women should never have any rights because they're all idiots, because he was married to a really intelligent woman, Sophia Peabody Hawthorne. But he's very, as you said, he's very cynical about that whole reform movement and the whole idea of volunteering and doing all these extracurricular activities. I agree, Richard, like he's trying to make a living for himself, and Hawthorne didn't always have a good financial situation. And so you can, Rob, if you want to explain how Pierce sort of helped him get into, a good position in Liverpool, which actually brought him out of the country.
Yeah, and I agree with all of the things that you folks are saying too, that I think it's important to point out the average New Englander, especially in the 1840s and 50s, they're not worried about slavery. It's just not affecting them personally. That's just the average New Englander. So the ones that are fighting to reform that really stick out. They are radical. And so, so I think Hawthorne deals with this idea of he wants his writings to be famous, but doesn't quite know what he's doing. He's having a really hard time with it for most of his career. He strikes gold in 1850 when he publishes The Scarlet Letter, follows it up immediately with The House of the Seven Gables, The Blithedale Romance. But he's moving around. He's going between jobs a lot. He had a couple government jobs for custom houses that didn't go well. He's living in the Berkshires at one point, meeting Herman Melville. He's very transient. He's really not settling down, not finding roots. And then his friend Franklin Pierce is kind of unexpectedly nominated to be president of the United States. And so Hawthorne is tapped to write this Life of Pierce to promote the candidate that no one had ever heard of before that moment. And there's even a great quote from, I think it was it Samuel Gridley Howe or somebody who says, if Hawthorne makes out Franklin Pierce to be a great man or even a good man, it will be the greatest piece of fiction he ever wrote.
I think it was Horace Mann.
Horace
right?
Mann, yes, who was Hawthorne's brother-in-law, which makes it even stranger. And actually, if you read his life of Franklin Pierce, he doesn't attempt to make him a good person or a great man. He's just kind of blah. He just does his thing, doesn't stand out. There's a couple of scenes when, his work as a general is kind of emphasized, but beyond that, I think Hawthorne emphasizes Franklin Pierce is nobody. But so when he gets the presidency, and again, this was all unexpected. Pierce never intended to run for president. Pierce probably never expected to win the presidency, but Hawthorne gets hooked up. And to be fair, Hawthorne had been hooked up throughout his career with government jobs because of his dedication to the Democratic Party. Franklin Pierce makes him consul of Liverpool, which was at that point considered the second most lucrative role in the consulships overseas. Wow. And Hawthorne takes that job very seriously. It's not just a comfy, cozy job for him. He works really hard. During that entire period, he doesn't write anything worthwhile. He suffers from writer's block. He's focused so much on his actual work as a government employee. That's what he's focused on. And that's extremely lucrative for him, enough that when that consulship ends, he moves with his family to Italy for a time and essentially spends the next couple of years touring and traveling, hopefully with the idea that he's picking up some ideas to get back into writing. And sure enough, he eventually will write The Marble Faun when he returns to the Wayside. Here I am in Concord.
Yeah, and I'm still waiting for the book that actually connects Hawthorne to the Beatles. So if you guys can work on that, that would be really great, because I'm convinced that there was something that he did in Liverpool that, you know, made it such a mecca for these young lads to be born there.
There will be ether involved, I'm sure.
Well, I can't speak to that, but
well, and so to get a little away from Hawthorne a little bit, we were talking about some of the obscure writers that you like. Are there maybe one or two obscure writers that you think should absolutely be household names, and for some reason you don't understand why they're no longer famous, and maybe tell about why they aren't famous?
well, I still think the poetry of Oliver Wendell Holmes deserves a much better reputation than it has. I think he's, especially compared to his contemporaries. Hosted a poetry discussion group years ago that highlighted James Russell Lowell, for example, and I would agree with this. We just couldn't get into him. It's not that he's a bad poet. It's just that he just doesn't have that flow that someone like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow has. But Oliver Wendell Holmes certainly does. You could grab any random poem of his and really get some kind of emotional response to it and read it easily enough, even if you don't get all of the references and allusions to Greek mythology and things like that, which are kind of infamous in 19th century American writing. I think going a little bit later, Paul Laurence Dunbar is one of the greatest poets that this country has ever seen. It's a tragedy that he died so young. Same kind of thing. Pick up any of his poems, you'll have a moment. But I think more than that, I often look at canonical writers and ask, why this one and not that one? Right. So for example, with Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter is great. I love The Scarlet Letter. I read it multiple times. I don't understand why that's the one that's anthologized the most. Give me The House of the Seven Gables. Go to that seventh grader, have him read The House of the Seven Gables, and I think you've got a much better shot at getting that kid to like Hawthorne rather than The Scarlet Letter. Jack London, I love Jack London, but not for The Call of the Wild or White Fang. In fact, I like The Call of the Wild, but I think White Fang is a complete waste of time. But he writes this novel called The Sea Wolf, which I think is phenomenal. Stephen Crane, Red Badge of Courage is fine, but if you haven't read his poetry from, for example, War is Kind or The Black Riders and Other Lines, that stuff will blow your mind. But we're too busy reading these canonical works to kind of dig under the surface and find the other stuff.
So what are your feelings about somebody like a Herman Melville, who obviously, I know that you and I both agree that Moby Dick is an absolutely amazing, brilliant book, but yet everybody hates it. and
it's challenging. And I think that's fair. I think it's fair to say that some of these 19th century works are challenging and not in the ways that the author wanted them to be challenging, right? With Melville, I've often said, okay, if Moby Dick is too much, pick up Bartleby the Scrivener. Tell me what you think of that. But that's another one that's frustrating, because if you can't get past the idea that this is supposed to be ridiculous, and I think Moby Dick has some elements of that too. It's supposed to be ridiculous. The chapters on cetology are supposed to be ridiculous. Melville is just kind of messing with you. And Bartleby the Scrivener is absolutely messing with you. And then the Civil War poetry that Melville writes, that stuff is amazing. His poem, Shiloh, a Requiem, is one of the most fantastic Civil War poems that anyone ever wrote. But no one thinks of Herman Melville's Civil War poetry when they think of Herman Melville.
Which as much as I love Moby Dick, I probably find myself reading his Civil War poetry more than anything else of his. I absolutely love his Civil War poetry. But it came out, in 1866? Nobody wanted to even think about the Civil War. And so it just kind of died a quick death.
Well, and at that point too, I think Melville had given up on the idea of being a popular writer. No pun intended, but that ship had sailed,
Right, many ships sailed.
But there's this whole, we focus a lot on sort of this core era of the 1840s and 50s in particular. That's when a lot of the big early classics burst onto the scene, whether it's The Scarlet Letter or Walden, or even going back a little earlier, The American Scholar by Emerson in 1837. So there's this like the second third of the 19th century where all the magic is happening. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that's happening in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s that's more than just Henry James. I'm not a fan of Henry James, but I find some of that stuff fun too. Like William Dean Howells has this novel called The Rise of Silas Lapham, which I think is very emblematic of that period of literature, and is also kind of funny in how it looks at Boston society in that era. There's one scene where he's invited to a party and he spends all this time outside the door deciding, should I knock or not? Because I'm not sure if I'm supposed to wear my gloves or if I'm just supposed to have my gloves in my pocket. If I'm not doing this right, will I be sent out of this party? Like, am I welcome here? You know?
Yeah. Well, wait, and he's like super obscure because he's one of the few people who had met Thoreau and Twain as well. So do you want to talk about him a little bit more? And you know, because I feel like that's sort of his whole idea, that he's not the artist, you know, he's just sitting back and watching all these other legends, you know, do
yeah, in a way, because he's this guy from Ohio, you know, that way out west in Ohio, right, Richard? And he comes to New England to take over the Atlantic Monthly. And yeah, I think he spends a couple of decades essentially, you know, pruning a bunch of up and coming writers, including Paul Laurence Dunbar and including Mark Twain. And it's this era, I think, where we're trying to define where literature is going in the United States. And that's where the birth of literary realism is coming in. That's where regional writing is coming in too, where you start seeing all this dialect writing. And I think Twain was doing a lot of that. You know, certainly his work is more than that, but a lot of his writing is very much based on the idea of regionalism, you know.
Well, and after the Civil War, you were also getting a lot of young writers who had been influenced by the war and influenced by the Confederacy, who were kind of writing from the Southern point of view. I mean, of course, we're very regional up here. All of our great writers are New England, of course. But there were many, many great Southern writers as well, I think, in the last half of the 19th century, who have kind of fallen out of favor either because they were Confederates, or they might have been maybe pro-Southern at one time, and nobody really talks about them anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because the South has its sort of literary renaissance happening much more slowly than it did in New England. There are quotes from some of the early Southern American writers that are basically saying intellectualism, culture, and literature is not really appreciated in the South, and that's why I'm floundering in the South. And I mean, there are names from that era. William Gilmore Simms is one of the big names from that era. Albert Pike is right, although he's originally from Boston, ends up moving to Arkansas territory in the 1830s and starts writing poetry that's, you know, it's okay. But yeah, you're right. Around this time of the Civil War and after, you start having this flowering of Southern literature with names like Henry Timrod, Paul Hamilton Hayne, and Sidney Lanier. In fact, when the country celebrated its bicentennial in 1876, Sidney Lanier is one of the folks that they invited to be like our guy to represent our 100-year anniversary of this country in Philadelphia, where the country was sort of founded. Although they also worked with John Greenleaf Whittier. So it's kind of a North meets South kind of a thing. But there's this sort of like passing of the baton where the reality is by the 1870s, yeah, these names are famous, but I don't know if that people are really flocking to the works of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Ralph Waldo Emerson the way that they've been doing 20 years before.
Right. Well, you know, we were talking about the 1840s and 50s, which is kind of, it's your forte. Those 20 years are kind of your forte. It's mine as well. But, you know, between 1850 and 55, you had Scarlet Letter, Uncle Tom's Cabin, House of Seven Gables, Walden, and Leaves of Grass. You know, 5 of the most amazing books of all time within this little 5-year span. But other than Uncle Tom's Cabin, I don't know if anybody at the time would have said that any of those books were earth-shattering, life-changing books.
Right. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, Moby Dick and Leaves of Grass in particular, yeah, they have their audience, but they don't really blow up until much later.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Leaves of Grass was a failure. Moby Dick was a failure. Walden was kind of, sort of a failure. What about Scarlet Letter and Seven Gables? Did they do okay?
Yeah, and it's one of the things with Hawthorne that surprises a lot of people that focus on writers of this era. Hawthorne was always critically successful, always. From the very beginning, the critics out there said, this guy's somebody to watch out for. He's a great writer. He's going to be a really important person for years and years and years to come. And then The Scarlet Letter, I think, is the beginning of his commercial success. It does well enough that he gets a decent amount of money from it. But it's in part because that's also the first book, I believe, that's working with Ticknor and Fields, right, which is like the publishing house in New England. And James T. Fields in particular knows how to market a book, not just print a book, press the button, watch the ink go onto the paper, but really say, this is the book that's out. You need to buy it. And here's why. Let me place some reviews in different magazines. And and Fields allegedly is the one that encouraged The Scarlet Letter to become a full-length novel. Allegedly, the story goes that Hawthorne was just writing another short story or series of short stories. And James T. Fields says, no, you gotta make this a longer book. And the folks in seventh grade who don't like The Scarlet Letter will tell you that's why it's so much drudgery, is he just padded the pages to make it a little longer. I don't know if that's true, but
yeah. Well, I think also seventh graders might like it because it ties back not only to the whole Salem witch trial, but Nathaniel Hawthorne actually had, an ancestor that was a judge. And even though he's like changed the spelling of his name and he's trying to avoid it, it's like there's some kind of legacy that he can never really escape.
Well, and a lot of Hawthorne's writing is based on the concept of, do we inherit guilt? Do we suffer for generations to come based on the sins of our ancestors? But more than that, the Scarlet Letter is a little titillating. Like, I don't know if I can talk about this, but the book's about adultery in the 19th century. And what's fascinating about it too is it's a book that's hinging upon the concept of sex, but there's no sex anywhere in this book.
Right. It's not Leaves of Grass.
Right, without a doubt.
Yeah, which is absolutely like, here's sex, here's lots of it, here's how I feel about my body, and here's naming all sorts of acts and pieces of the body, and it's okay, like it's sensual, like let's get into it.
Well, Walt was a New Yorker, Hawthorne was from Salem,
Yeah, and I think it's okay to say Hawthorne was a prude. Even for that era, I think Hawthorne was very much a prude. And I think the questions that he writes about in things like The Scarlet Letter and The House of the Seven Gables, these concepts of sin and guilt, I think he wasn't just writing about it. I think he was exploring it for himself too. I think he really believed that these questions were complicated and he needed some answers for himself, even as he knew he would never be able to answer them.
Right. Now, Rob, I know that you're a big fan of Hawthorne's short stories. Don't you think that his short stories get seriously a short shrift when it comes to people who read Hawthorne?
Yeah, and I think Hawthorne, he was a short story writer first and foremost, who also wrote a few novels. That should be how he is considered, because that is the reality. He wrote a few novels, he wrote a ton of short stories and sketches. And I think he would have continued in that route if it wasn't for James T. Fields allegedly convincing him to write a novel. The other side of this too, though, is novels were new in the United States. There wasn't a huge series of novels coming out before the 1850s. And the ones that did come out, they don't really look the way novels look today. They're not as coherent. They're not as focused on having an overarching storyline. Short stories, however, were the way to go. And you can thank Washington Irving for that. In 1809, when he publishes the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Irving establishes American literature is short stories. And then you have Edgar Allan Poe, who's philosophizing on the concept of being able to read in a single sitting and get your point across with a unity of effect in a relatively short period of space. And I think Hawthorne's stories, are amazing. There's a lot of stuff that will come out in the novels too, but that's also where I think Hawthorne is funniest. He has this short story called Feathertop, for example, which is about a scarecrow who comes to life. He has this short story called Monsieur du Miroir, which hinges on just a single joke that if you don't get like a third of the way through, it just doesn't work. I'll talk about it because I think it's very obscure, but it's one of his best. Monsieur du Miroir is basically about Hawthorne himself. And he has this companion that keeps showing up throughout his life. And this companion keeps emulating his expressions and wearing the same outfits as him. And no matter how sneakily he tries to arrive at some place by surprise, this companion always shows up. Well, because it's his reflection in a mirror. And if you don't get the joke, like, you don't understand, why does this guy keep showing up, you know?
Right.
But the whole thing is just one long joke. And at one point he even says that, you know, this guy, his whole business is reflection, you know?
Right.
What's your favorite short story?
You know, probably I would say Rappaccini's Daughter. I think that's a great story. It's got some intrigue. It's got some mystery. It's dark. And I, you know, again, it's another one that explores the concept of inherent sin, right? Is this person a bad person because she's, I don't want to spoil the ending, but she's partially poisonous? Does that make her a bad person by default? Or is it just an aspect of her personality? And then when we try to take away that evil sense, that sense of evil in her, will she survive without it?
So one of the buzzwords that I always hear educators and others use about Hawthorne, and I hate this phrase, they call him a dark romantic. Is, in your opinion, is Hawthorne Gothic? Is he a dark romantic?
Well, you know, Gothic is a loaded term because Gothic has a very complicated origin and definition. I would say he's a dark romantic. He loved the term romance, for one thing. Romance to him was the equivalent of fiction. The idea that I can create a story that's kind of based on reality, but didn't really happen, but could really happen, but it couldn't really happen, right? And I think the difference in dark romanticism compared to, like, say, transcendentalism, and this is why I think Hawthorne fits into that category, the concept is, it's all based on the concept that we are inherently negative people. We are inherently bad people. We are inherently negative. We are defined by our guilt and our sins. And we see that in Hawthorne. We see that in Melville. We see that in Poe. We don't see that in Emerson. We don't see that in Thoreau. We don't see that in Margaret Fuller. So those are kind of like these polar opposites that I think made, going back to your point from earlier, made it clear that Hawthorne was not and never would be a transcendentalist.
Right.
So if he's not a transcendentalist and all, you know, and he's coming at it from a completely different point of view, why did he come to Concord?
You know, it's a great question. What I love about Hawthorne is how hard it is to nail down Hawthorne. You know, I think he came to a place like Concord, and the name itself means coming together, right? He wanted to be a part of that community, even as he isolated himself from that community. And Thoreau did that too, right? So Thoreau is very proud to be from Concord, very proud, you know, what an estimable place. And then he isolates himself from the vast majority of the people of Concord and criticizes them and, you know, judges them. And
right.
Hawthorne
kind of Concord, he just didn't like Concordians.
Right. And I think Hawthorne wanted to be part of a community and felt the community of Concord, but didn't want to be a part of that community. But, like, you know, I think that is one of the best things about Hawthorne. I again, buzzwords, right? But Hawthorne and ambiguity, it's not just in his writing, it's in his life story as well. Anything I can tell you about Hawthorne, you can easily disprove.
Right. Well, and I think that Hawthorne and Thoreau and Emerson and Bronson Alcott, I think they all thought each other were geniuses, but they weren't really sure if they were geniuses. You know, they certainly, at least Hawthorne kind of looked at the other three, kind of just wondering what these people were all about. I think that he thought that Emerson was a genius, but misguided. I think that he thought Thoreau was a really good writer. But, you know, Hawthorne and Thoreau, and I'm pretty sure Bronson Alcott, never read anything that Hawthorne ever wrote. So, but yet I think that Emerson thought that Hawthorne was a genius, but he was misguided because he's wasting his time on novels and short stories.
Yeah, I think so. They are looking for very different styles of writing, very different audiences for that matter. And one of my favorite parts of the story of Hawthorne and Concord is from Emerson, actually. And we're recording this on Emerson's birthday, so this is appropriate too. When Hawthorne dies relatively young in 1864, Emerson writes something to the effect of, you know, I tried to reach out to him. I tried to get to know him. I tried to be his friend, and I never knew him.
Right.
And this is after years of having this kind of relationship. that he just still never knew Hawthorne.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but I mean, but anybody that was friends with Waldo Emerson, they tried to get to know him too. And he never really warmed up that closely to anybody. I mean, each one of these people, let's say Emerson, Hawthorne, Thoreau, they all had these walls around each other throughout their lives. And they were very careful about who they let in to their inner circle. And the fact that the three men could hang out together at all and even get along, I think says a lot about their personalities. And the fact that they kind of sort of liked each other and they kind of sort of thought they were geniuses. But again, as long as they didn't discuss politics or nature or literature, they probably got along just fine.
Well, and I'd like to throw Margaret Fuller into that mix too, because I feel like she's
the wild card, because she scared the heck out of all of these guys.
Yeah, I agree.
None of them knew what to do with Margaret. She was this complete anomaly that nobody knew what to do with her, especially Emerson, Thoreau, and Hawthorne.
Yeah. You know, she shows up and hangs out with Emerson. He invites her to stay at his house for extended periods of time. And, you know, she's out in the woods wandering around, and, you know, she sort of has this awkward relationship, I think, with Hawthorne, where they're fascinated with each other, but sort of, you know, strangely attracted, but also strangely repulsed. And he ends up including her in one of his novels.
Yeah, it's
in a really creepy way.
It's probably even tougher to explain Hawthorne and Fuller than Hawthorne and Thoreau, especially when you throw in Mrs. Hawthorne. You know, Sophia Peabody, before she was married, was attending Margaret Fuller's conversations in Boston, which were hosted by her sister, Elizabeth Peabody, at their bookshop. And she's very much an admirer of Margaret Fuller. And then they get married, and Margaret Fuller publishes Woman in the 19th Century, and Sophia writes, I think Margaret Fuller is writing about things that she should not be writing about. And it's sort of like, well, what happened? Didn't you support her a minute ago? And
right.
I'm sure it was Nathaniel's influence.
Wasn't Sophia kind of, I mean, I would consider her an early transcendentalist.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it was the influence of Nathaniel. It probably was. Those two became very like-minded. In a way, I think it's kind of endearing that they were an adorable couple, and they both kind of shed some of their personal beliefs in order to envelop the personal beliefs of the other. But transcendentalism did not survive in that marriage. That is not one of the things that they shared.
And she was a painter as well. She sort of came into the relationship as her own level of artist. And I think she sort of was okay to sort of back off a little bit and be in her husband's shadow later on, which is
right.
You know.
And whether that was his influence or not, it's really hard to tell. You know, was he an oppressive husband? I mean, the actions.
Was that the attitude of the day? You know.
Well, yeah, and the reality is they both write so lovingly about one another. It's hard to think that anything negative was going on between the two of them. And then Hawthorne may or may not have been informed from Margaret Fuller in creating the character of Hester Prynne. That's certainly one possibility. But more obviously, she shows up in the Blithedale Romance by name. Actually, the main character in the Blithedale Romance actually receives a letter from Margaret Fuller. And so Margaret Fuller becomes a character in one of Hawthorne's novels, and also may have inspired the Zenobia character in that book as well.
Yeah, who and not, spoiler alert, right? Like there's a drowning that happens that is also based on a very specific woman named Martha Hunt that happened like behind the old manse, that
on their 1 year anniversary.
That he witnessed and helped drag out of the river. But the fact that Margaret Fuller had also died by drowning is sort of one of those things that, you know, is like really, if you really like someone, that
is this an homage or is this throwing shade? It's really hard to determine.
Aren't they the same thing? but and I don't want to be an armchair psychologist, but you know, so we know that certainly Bronson Alcott and Abba, they had issues in their marriage. There were certainly tensions between Ralph Waldo Emerson and Lydian. You don't hear those kind of stories in the marriage of Nathaniel and Sophia Hawthorne. certainly don't hear about there being issues or them disagreeing or having any kind of tension. Either they were really good at keeping it behind closed doors, but I actually think they had probably the strongest marriage out of all of the conquered people.
Yeah, it would be my impression too. And actually, Margaret Fuller actually approves of their engagement, and she writes something to the effect of, to Sophia, she says something to the effect of, if any man can understand woman's place and support her, it is Nathaniel Hawthorne, or something like that.
Yeah.
Now, you could argue a couple of things here, though. Remember that Hawthorne burns a bunch of letters from Sophia before their move to Europe. And throughout parts of their marriage, they had a joint journal between Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne. So it's certainly possible that what evidence is left behind just happens to be the kind of evidence that wouldn't dispute this positive situation. Yeah. But I do think they were adorable. I think that as a couple, they're almost disgusting. There are these great accounts of their first year of marriage in Concord in particular that are a little bit, hey, that's a little racy here,
Right.
Yeah. He wasn't shy about his wife. At least, I think Margaret Fuller was coming for a visit and kind of walked in on them kind of making out or something one day. Yeah.
But it's also funny that I think it's indicative of the times that we make the assumption that it's a 19th century marriage. How good could it have been, right? Because we're so used to the idea that these are essentially loveless marriages in the 19th century, but certainly Hawthorne was a big exception.
Yeah. So Rob, before we wrap it up, we do have a program coming up at the end of June. Hopefully we'll be able to talk about it a little bit. Well, go ahead and give us a little blurb about the program for the House of Seven Gables.
So yeah, this is a program that Richard and I have done many, many times. And essentially it's an idea of how we can explore the relationship between Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry David Thoreau, 100% using 19th century words from letters, journals, literature, newspapers, and so forth. And I hope by the end of the program, you come to the same understanding that Richard and I have, that somehow Hawthorne and Thoreau were some version of friends, even if they weren't the closest of friends. And the action takes place mostly in Concord, a little bit in Salem, and a little bit overseas as well. And it's a fun one. I think there have been times when we've performed this program that we've had to take out the tissues for people.
This does make people cry. I will tell you that right now. At the end of the production, you will be crying.
Yes.
And we did get a standing ovation the first time we performed it.
Yep.
So Rob and I both said we think it's one of the best things that we've ever done.
Yeah.
And in addition to shows like this, do you guys regularly perform together or hang out at historical sites as the character, in character, so that people can visit both of you?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
When Rob's in town, when he's visiting Concord, you can often see Mr. Thoreau and Mr. Hawthorne hanging outside of the manse, saying snarky things to people and saying snarky things to each other. And
we've been known to join in parades through Concord for Patriots Day as well.
Rain or shine.
Hawthorne and Thoreau go for a walk, and a parade breaks out around us. It's the strangest thing. People just follow us everywhere. But and the snarkier they are to people, the more people love it. It's the weirdest thing.
Yeah. And do you guys have any other further plans to expand either this show or your collaborations together?
If anybody is interested in Rob and I doing our Thoreau Hawthorne program, you can certainly contact us. We're both on Facebook. Rob has a American literary blog that he posts on Facebook and elsewhere. I've got my Meet Henry David Thoreau page. Mr. Hawthorne and Mr. Thoreau will travel and do the program. But what's your literary blog again called, Rob?
Yeah, you got it. The American Literary Blog. Yeah.
And if you want to find more facts about all of the obscure authors that were mentioned, I can highly recommend it as a place where you can make new discoveries every day. And Rob does a really great job with that.
Thanks.
Rob, this has been absolutely wonderful. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Tammy, for letting us basically just get together and chat.
Geek out, yeah.
We're not doing it at the Colonial Inn for a change.
Okay.
But thank you so much for joining us. And for everybody that has watched us today, thank you for joining in. And this has been another episode of Concord Days.